Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Farah Faizah and I am with Dara Raihatul Jannah, which we will present about the first topic, which is making a treaty and entry into force. So next slide, please. When does a treaty enters into force? So based on Article 24 of the 1969 Vienna Convention, the treaty enters into force when we have 4 points here, when in such manner and upon such date as it may provide or as the negotiation states may agree. The second one is failing any such provision or agreement, a treaty enters into force as soon as consent to be bound by the treaty has been established for all the negotiating states. And the third is when the consent of a state to be bound by a treaty is established on a date after the treaty has come into force. So the last one is the provisions of a treaty regulating the authentication of its text, the establishment of the consent of states to be bound by the treaty, the manner or date of its entry into force, reservations, the functions of the depository and other matters arising necessarily before the entry into force of the treaty apply from the time of the adoption of its text. So when it becomes legally binding, that is when a treaty enters into force. A treaty does not enter into force when it is actually adopted, but the date of entry into force may be a date specified in the treaty or a date on which a specified number of ratifications, approvals, acceptance, or accessions have been deposited with the depository. So the date of entry may often be at a specified time mentioned in the treaty following its ratification or accession by a fixed number of states. For example, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child entered into force on 2nd September 1990, the 30th day following the deposit of the 20th States Instrument of Ratification or Accession. So we will continue on the next slide, which is listed our subtopics for today's presentation. I will explain about the formalities, the general consent, and consent by signature. And Dara will explain about the consent by exchange of instruments, consent by ratification, and consent by accessions. So next slide, please. The first one is the formalities. So it is stated here that treaties may be made by the parties in virtually any manner they wish. It means that there is no prescribed form or procedure and how a treaty is formulated and by whom it is actually signed will depend upon the intention and agreement of the states concerned. Treaties may be drafted as between states or governments or head of states or governmental departments, whichever appears the most. So it is also stated here that there are certain rules that apply in the formation of international conventions. Like in international law, states have the capacity to make agreements, but since states are not identifiable human persons, particular principles have evolved to ensure that people or persons that representing the states indeed have the power to do so for the purpose of concluding the treaty in question. Such such persons must produce what is termed full powers according to Article 7 of the Convention before being accepted as capable of representing their countries. So full powers refers to documents certifying status from the competent authorities of the state in question. So that's all from the formalities. We will continue to the consent. So the consent of the state parties to the treaty in question is actually a very vital factor. The text of the agreement drawn up by the negotiators of the parties have to be adopted, and Article 9 also provides that adoption in international conferences takes place by the vote of two-thirds of the states present and voting, unless by the same majority it is decided to apply a different rule. So the consent of the state parties to the treaty in question is a very vital factor, just like it is stated in the PowerPoint, since states may be bound only by their consent, and if they do not receive the consent of various states, their provisions will not be binding upon them. So next, we'll explain about the consent by signature, which stated that accordingly, provision is made for consent to be expressed by signature. So a state may regard itself as having given its consent to the text of the treaty by signature in defined circumstances noted by Article 12. That's all from me. Dara will continue the presentation.
Well, thank you, Farah. So I would like to continue about this consent of the state parties to the treaty. So the next one is consent by exchange of instrument. So of course, we asking about what is the meanings of exchange of instrument in this. So back to the terms of a treaty is used generically to describe a variety of instruments, including a convention, agreements, arrangement, protocols, covenant, charter, and act. So that I mentioned before, it is called the instrument. And based on Article 13 of the 1969 Vienna Conventions, provides that instrument exchange between the state for binding them to a treaty may be expressed when the instrument declare that their exchange shall have the effect. And next is consent by ratification. So ratification itself defines the international act whereby a state indicates it consents to be bound to a treaty if the parties intended to show their consent by such an act. And I would like to say that in the case of bilateral treaties, ratification is usually accomplished by exchanging the requisite instrument, while in the case of multilateral treaties, the usual procedure is for the depository to collect the ratification of all states, keeping all parties informed of the institution also. So the institution of ratification grants states the necessary time frame seek the required approval for the treaty on domestic level and to enact the necessary legislation to give domestic effect to that treaty. And also, the rules relating to ratifications vary from country to country. So, in the UK, all through the power of ratifications comes within the prerogative of the Crown, it has become accepted that treaties involving any change in municipal law or adding to the financial burdens of the government or having impact upon the private rights of British subject will be first submitted to Parliament and subsequently ratified. There is, in fact, a procedure known as the Ponsonby Rule, which provides that all treaties subject to ratification are laid before Parliament at least 20 days before the actual ratification takes place. And we can look at this slide. Based on Article 14 of the 1969 Vienna Convention, notes that ratification will express state consent to be bound by treaty, where first the treaty so provides, and then the representative of the state has signed the treaty subject to ratification appears from the full power of its representative, and then ratification is only necessary it is clearly contemplated by the parties to the treaty, like adopted by UK. And the last one is ratification should be required unless the treaty clearly reveals contrary intention. And the next one is consent by accession. So accession in here is the act whereby a state accepts the offer or the opportunity to become a party to a treaty already negotiated and signed by other states. And this accession has the same effect as a ratification. This usually occurs after the treaty has entered into force and the Secretary General of the United Nations in his function as depository has also accepted accession to some convention before their entry into force. And like in this slide, accession just occurred because of two reasons. Our first is when a state becomes a party to a treaty that it has not signed, either because the treaty provides that signature is limited for a certain state and it is not such a state. And the second is particular deadline for a signature has passed. And also in the Article 15, consent by accession is possible when a treaty so provide and also negotiating state were agreed or subsequently agree consent that could occur in the case of the state in question. So I think just is for us to explain for today's presentation. Maybe Farah want to tell anything or not?
I guess it's all from us for today. Maybe we will continue if there is any question from the class for next class, maybe.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.